Welcome to the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show, issue number 77.
Boom.
Hey everyone, welcome to Pop XP. And before the show starts, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload awesome new content. And don't forget, if you can, make sure to share our stream on all your social media outlets. We appreciate it, and thanks for helping us grow the Pop XP channel.
Welcome, everybody, to the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show, issue 77, and we are back live and in charge. And before we get into it, we got the guy below here, Niall Scala. Scala, what's going down, brother?
Hey, what is going on, everyone? Welcome for tuning in with us tonight. As you all know, please look below, click that subscribe button, and smash that bell to get notifications when we're live like we're doing right now. We upload some awesome new videos. And also, please, if you're interested in streaming, make sure to check out one of our sponsors with StreamYard. Links are below, and click that affiliate link. And gentlemen, I'm excited. We're joining into a topic, right? We're kind of pushing away a little bit from comics, a little bit, but diving into a world of what would you say? A bit of Dungeons and Dragons, maybe? I don't know. I got a sword somewhere here. I don't know.
I always have to take Steve on these little journeys. Sometimes,
yeah,
a
bit of a side quest, Steve.
Yeah, a little, side quest. Like actually, like in Dungeons and Dragons, what do? Let's go left. But
an alien? What your girlfriend wants, Steve? Come on, we're live, bro.
Today we have a special guest, but like we do in a few episodes, sometimes we deviate from strictly comic books, and then Steve gets mad and all this stuff, but then we find out he has metal miniatures too. He had them too back in the day. He had his wrestling magazines, but you know me, guys. I have this passion for Dungeons and Dragons, the old school stuff. And if anybody remembers when we had Billy Tucci on, we did our top 5 villains of all time in pop culture. And this guy wrote these bestsellers that were near and dear to my heart because I ranked this character as number 2, and I'm still obsessed with him. Everybody who knows Dragonlance and Ravenloft knows Lord Soth. I'm just a crazy. Yes, he's a knockoff of Dr. Doom, and that's why Dr. Doom was number 1. I was a little upset that Steve didn't rank Dr. Doom number 1. I think he went for Thanos. I was a little pissed there. But Steve, tell me this, Steve. When it comes to Dungeons and Dragons back in the day, where you grew up, there was a lot of the role-playing stuff was pretty big back in the day. Do you have any recollection of Dungeons and Dragons or White Dwarf or all those any of those games that were played? Because it got big in your neck of the woods over there. Do you have any recollection?
None of my friends played that game because you had to be more affluent to play that game, and all of my friends were poor. So I would hear rumors of people who would play Dungeons and Dragons, but generally speaking, it was an unknown thing for me, and so it was only when I would watch a movie, a pop culture movie, and they'd be like, "Oh, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons." I'd be like, "Oh, okay, I guess that must be big." I had no connection. I didn't know anyone that was into it. Not until years later did I realize just how big it was, because I was aware of gaming and stuff like that because I used to play a game called Risk, which is a war game.
Yeah.
But when it came to the Dungeons and Dragons, no.
Steve, I'm interested. I don't know if you remember back in the 80s, there was called the Satanic Panic. They all, the early 80s, Dungeons and Dragons got a big media blitz. It was starting to sell crazy, but because one kid, I think, committed suicide or did something, parents got involved, and they all thought, kids were getting crazy. They were worshiping the devil and all this stuff while they're playing this wacky new game that like you acted out. And Tom Hanks, actually, one of his first movies, he did a made-for-TV. You smiled down there, Niall. Do you remember that movie? Do you remember that?
I'm just laughing because it's like, back then it's like D&D is making kids go satanic, and now it's like Call of Duty and then all these other games and everything. It's just hold your children accountable, people. Come on.
But Steve, what I wanted to ask you, did you ever hear any of that rumblings of the Satanic Panic or Dungeons and Dragons was this cult game that you shouldn't get into? Did you ever hear that? I mean, I know you weren't into it, but because that's what really put Dungeons and Dragons on the map.
No, because if that was early 80s, it was just at that time it was a question of survival in our family, and there was no disposable time for playing games or anything. So, I don't want to say it's like Charles Darwin's time, but we had a small, tiny little black TV that was this big.
Yeah.
And then we had one little heater with one bar. So I was out of pop culture and stuff like that. It wasn't until years later that I realized when I came over to the States and saw some documentaries, I did see reference to it. So I do know what you're talking about.
Well, you see the art now, and to be honest with you, Dungeons and Dragons now as a brand is bigger than it's ever been. I mean, it is enormous. I know they had the movie. I wasn't too crazy about that, but that name Dungeons and Dragons, it's almost like it's not Marvel and it's not Star Wars, but it has a tremendous following. And like I said, I was always into it. I didn't really ever get to play much and all that stuff, but after the pandemic and all this stuff, when all that was going on, I kind of got back into it and I kind of played, I started just more of the collecting. And so I started going back to the old books I started reading when I was a kid and all that stuff. And I really got on the buzz. But this guy who we have here today, I'm so happy he's here because I've been hounding this guy forever. And the reason why is because he was on the inside of all this stuff that was going on with TSR, and then it got bought out by Wizards of the Coast, and now Hasbro owns the brand. But there's all this crazy stuff that was going on, and he was kind of in the throes of all that, like any big corporation, people making bad mistakes and all that stuff. And I just love to hear the inside stories and the inside scoop of all that stuff. And I love to pick people's brain, and especially this guy right here, who was a comic fan too, because we got some proof of that too. And I want to talk about how he got into the field of this huge pop culture phenomenon. And Steve, what is funny, what comic people don't get like us, do you know there's a lot of gaming cons? There's like a Gary Con, a Gen Con. There are these huge cons that a lot of comic people don't even know that even go on and all that stuff. And I know he was just a recent guest at a con. So without further ado, let's bring in Mr. James Lowder, best-selling author. Woo! Mr. Lowder.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Now, James,
you talk about Pardew the magician, Pardew the cleric, the Tom Hanks character, or the
what was the name of that movie? What was the name?
Oh God, now I can't think of it. It's Rona Jaffe wrote it. It was like you said, it was about the Satanic Panic stuff. What had happened? That story was based on a guy in Michigan, college student who disappeared supposedly into the steam tunnels underneath the college playing the game, and actually he didn't want to deal with his family, and so he had run away. And so he didn't die. The game didn't kill him. There were others. It's like any of the other moral panics around. It's the 50s in comics, right? So anything bad happened, that parents didn't understand D&D. They didn't read any of this stuff, so they blamed it on the game.
Amazing monsters.
Yeah, You got a
Amazing
picture?
Monsters?
Yes.
I
Yeah.
don't. I just looked it up really quick. The
Yeah.
name.
Ron Jaffe wrote the book that it was. Yeah. It was
And
whatever.
Tom Hanks is he goes nuts, like he becomes that, like
And that
he
was you play and you become your character and you lose yourself and you
But-
lose your ability to discern reality from fantasy, which again you go back to Frederick Wortham and what he wrote about in the comic stuff for Seduction of the Innocent.
Yeah.
Right.
And what's funny, I remember being a kid, and I remember that it was on like one of the TV movies. I think it was like, the movie of the week.
Yeah.
And I remember like seeing it in the TV guide, and I was like, and they made it look so incredible and all that, And I remember watching it I was in New Hampshire, in at my aunt's house in Candia, New Hampshire. And I remember with my brother and my cousins, we were watching it. And even I was kind of like, I don't know if this is that good. I wanted to see the Dungeons.
There was a whole 60-minute segment on it. There you go. It was a 60-minute segment, and Jack Chick did a, infamous Dark Dungeons comic, little, anti D&D track from the far religious right. And, I was playing at that time. I started playing in the game in 77, 78. And so I lost friends. There were friends' parents who would not let them hang around with me because I played D&D. But what you'd met, and the other thing you mentioned, the crossover between comics and gaming, huge. We talked about comics all the time at TSR. I mean, they did a Marvel role-playing game. There was a Marvel role-playing game.
Oh yeah.
In the 80s, it was big. And there are all kinds.
Yeah, it was crazy.
Yeah.
So James.
Yeah.
How did you talk about your beginnings? I mean, obviously, you were a comics fan too growing up. Tell me your origins on like how did you started getting into the field, but like reading comics and all that. Go from the beginning.
Yeah, I was interested in all kinds of fantasy, science fiction, horror from when I was really little. I mean, one of the first things I remember reading was my older brother's copy of Justice League Volume 1, 22, issue 22, the second half of the first Earth 1, Earth 2 crossover. The first JLA, JSA crossover. It was my
when Superman meets Captain.
Yeah. The two Green Lanterns fighting together. The two, it was one of the old Gardner Fox things, and so that was late 60s. But through the 70s, I was, a huge fan of the Atlas monster comic reprints that Marvel did. I was a huge fan of, all the Marvel stuff. The weird DC stuff like Doom Patrol and Metal Men and the really odd DC stuff, Legion of Superheroes. But then my big thing in the 70s was Marvel. I was a big Howard the Duck, Tomb of Dracula.
Nice.
All of that core. The point at which, and Invaders too. I mean, Roy stuff, especially between Marvel and DC. That was a big thing, and I read a lot of other kinds of fantasy, novels and movies and all of it. It was just, all pop culture goes into the blender, right? And high art, low art, right? Because I'm a big fan. I mean, Seven Samurai poster back there. The one next to it is Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter. So no high art, low art distinction for me. Which is why partly D&D appealed to me, because effectively, and this is, for Steve, D&D is really group storytelling with the rule system basically doing the modeling for what the outcomes of what the players are saying they want to do. That's all role-playing games are. And as an art form, it's completely new because it merges structured play with the rule set, with the free form, almost improv stuff that the players create around the table. So as a storytelling medium, it's amazing. It's amazing. And so I fell in with that. I wrote a lot of stuff and drew my own comics when I was a kid. I'm a terrible artist. Much better writer, I hope. eventually, my goal was to get a PhD and teach medieval lit. That was originally what I was hoping to do. I have an undergrad degree, double major in English and history, and a minor in philosophy. I went to grad school in English. I loved teaching. I hated academia. And so I peeled off from that. And then coming back to, I'm from Boston originally, from South Shore, Massachusetts originally, out here in Wisconsin to attend Marquette University, and ended up getting a job. My first job offer in the industry was Gary Gygax, the guy who co-created D&D, offered me a job at the company he started after he left TSR. That didn't come to pass, and then TSR offered me a job in the book department. And so I was working, and this has been my job since 1988. My first professional publication in gaming was a thing on how to design cities for superhero role-playing games. So if you're talking about that crossover between comics and games, that was the first thing I sold as a pro to Gateways magazine. Jeff Gomez was running that out of his apartment in '87. But I ended up working on all of this cross-media stuff. So I was doing the novels that were connected to D&D. And then while I was at TSR, I got involved in the DC comics that were being licensed at the time. I left TSR in the early 90s, and I've been freelancing full-time since, and have done novels and comics and games and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, to take it back for a second, because it's funny how much Roy, speaking of Roy, how much he influenced like that. Gygax and them, they were reading those Conan comics all the time, because Conan Conan #1, that was so huge at the time in those mid 70s and all that stuff.
Well, they were all pulling the same things together, right? So if you look at the Marvel comics in the 70s, and this is as Gygax is pulling together, and Dave Arneson and his group up in Minneapolis are pulling together the things that became Dungeons and Dragons. They're pulling in the same Conan, Clark Ashton Smith, the things that were being reprinted in the 70s that were at the same time influencing, especially like the Marvel comics. You see the horror things that came in through Tomb of Dracula and the stuff, Gerber and Wolfman and those guys are pulling in. That was all being pulled in at parallel with the guys doing the early creation of D&D.
Yeah, it's funny. And that was Roy's tenure when he started as the editor-in-chief. He was the editor-in-chief pushing all that stuff, Roy. And what's funny, the reason why I mention that is because you wouldn't believe how many times when we go to shows and all that stuff, and Roy sometimes has no idea what just the impact that he made on the world. And I would say to him, like, Roy, you had stuff to do with this, and he was like, really? Oh, all right. It's so nothing to him, but he really did that whole sword and sorcery thing, and it was getting out there. And I loved, and that was with me with the Dungeons and Dragons, because I wasn't a big Conan fan at the beginning, but I got into the Dungeons and Dragons stuff, and then I went back. And then when they made the Conan game, remember that? They made the big Conan, and then Conan the Barbarian, and then the movies all started coming in. And I mean, it it was such a wonderful time of getting in there. Now, you said, just really quick, you said that you got into TSR when they started the books and all that stuff. I remember that when they started the line of books, because obviously, did it start with Dragonlance? Was Dragonlance the first time that they produced books?
Well, those were really the first novels they did.
Novels.
They had done the Choose Your Own Adventure books starting in the early '80s that Rose Estes, company, and those were the fighting fantasy books in the UK. Later on, did kind of the same thing, with the Games Workshop stuff. They came up with the idea. Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss were the authors for the first 6 Dragonlance novels. They weren't originally supposed to be the author. Tracy had pitched the game, and they were developing the game material, and then they said, hey, why don't we try this? Why don't we try novels? And they decided they were going to do the first Dragonlance novel in the mid 80s. The original author didn't work out. This will be a theme for part of the soft discussion too. The original author didn't work out. They brought Margaret and Tracy, who were both in-house, Tracy was in the game department. Margaret was in the book department, and gave them a try to see how they would do. Jean Blatchfield Black was the woman running the book department at the time in the mid 80s, and she was a genius. She recognized what they could do, and those books sold incredibly well. So podunky little publisher, D&D is doing well, but the Satanic Panic had really hurt the company. And with the Choose Your Own Adventure books, and then the wild success of these Dragonlance books, the first 6, it really revitalized the company. And so they tried a couple of other fiction projects. They did some other reprints and things like that because they had amazing stories at the time, too. They'd always published fiction in Dragon magazine from the start. There had always been a connection because, like you mentioned, Gygax was influenced by Conan, and if you look at the early D&D books, some of them have lists in the back of fiction that influenced this book, that kind of thing. And so after the D&D novels succeeded, they tried a couple of other books. They did well. Around 1987, 88, they decided they were really going to launch a full-fledged program at the company for fiction. And I got hired in 1988 just as that was taking off.
Yeah, that was interesting. I remember seeing those books. And as for the Dragonlance books, I remember being in middle school at that time, and I remember kids were reading it, and I remember it was bizarre, and I just got fascinated by it because I was like, Dungeons and Dragons makes books, I was like, it was so radically different because obviously you had the hardcover books and all that stuff for the game, but there was actually stories, and obviously those was Elmore, right? He drew the covers.
Yeah. Larry Elmore did the paintings. I mean,
Larry did that,
right? So they've got
iconic
Keith Parkinson and Larry Elmore and Clyde Caldwell and the other people, Jeff Easley, who did a ton of great stuff for the comics as well. Those are in-house or almost full-time artists for the company. And they had that to draw on as well. So they pulled in that fantasy art at the same time. And the novels, the first 6 Dragonlance novels, tell the story of an unlikely group of adventurers who get pulled together to do this epic quest. And so that mirrors what the sort of traditional D&D story is. Your unlikely group of heroes go off on this adventure to do this thing. And so it was indicative of what D&D was as a game. It wasn't, fiction isn't D&D. It's not the same thing. But it was indicative of what the experience of playing in the game was like.
James, did they tie those novels together though with some of the books with the game, so you could carry on the story on your own?
One of the interesting things initially was Tracy also designed. They did initially 12 modules, game scenarios that ran parallel to the books, and they developed the stories in other ways. Now all of this is considered transmedia. It's what you do where you do the comic and the novel and the movie and the breakfast cereal, and all of this is tied together. All of this was being done at TSR at the time on the fly, and with Dragonlance it was largely done in the mid 80s with people in house. So Margaret and Tracy were both staff people at the time. The other people that they had working on the core of the Dragonlance stuff were all right there in Lake Geneva, which is like I said, a tiny resort town in southeast Wisconsin, and it blew up from there. And so they started doing sequels and things like that to the books, additional material, and they bought the Forgotten Realms, which was another setting from Ed Greenwood in Canada. And then they did Dark Walker on Moonshae, which was the first Realms novel that Douglas Niles wrote in 87. And the Realms was the setting for the D&D movie that just came out. That's set in the Forgotten Realms.
Right. What's interesting about those early TSR story, it reminded me of the early Marvel bullpen. They were just this kind of small group
Yeah.
that were changing the world, and like they were just kind of all local because you had to be pretty much local to New York at the time,
Right.
and so you had to be local in Lake Geneva, right? You had to be.
Yeah, I mean that was the for the most part the people who, especially through the 80s, a lot of the designers were people who were local. Now they had freelancers around the world who were doing some of the design, but the core was through about 87, 88, all Lake Geneva. The thing that changed, and this changed after I started, was the company started expanding who they were bringing in. And so you had Dragonlance novels that were being written by people around the country and then eventually around the world. The Forgotten Realms expanded,
Right.
so Ed Greenwood remained up in Canada, but he was still doing the core of the design for the Forgotten Realms stuff. Bob Salvatore out in Massachusetts creates Drizzt and submits
Drizzt,
it. As you know, and all of the R.A. Salvatore novels that have come from that were all Bob, submitted it from outside the company. And what we did then, especially in the book department, was try and expand the number of people who were providing that kind of creative input, and that came with complications. But yes, it grew from, and the analogy though is solid, especially from the 70s and 80s at TSR, was very much like the old Marvel bullpen.
That's cool.
All right, before I give it to Steve, I want to say this. I'm going to tell you what actually hurt the TSR. Being a comic guy, what actually truly hurt the Dragonlance novel in the grand scheme. What made Marvel, especially Marvel, so good is that you had people like Roy Thomas, Steve Englehart, Steve Gerber, people that were these Mark Grunwald, people that were these continuity freaks that always went to the source material and they expanded on it. Right. The problem with the Dragonlance stuff and the fun, and you try to fix this. This is where I'm going with this. I know you did.
I know where this.
What happened? Yeah, but what happened was you start reading these novels, you get into it, you get so invested in these characters, then all of a sudden you read the next book and it's kind of like, or the next series, and it was like, wait a second, that didn't even happen. Or he didn't do that, and you started seeing this little disconnect. And ultimately, they had so many people writing these books that all of a sudden it became this jigsaw puzzle. And this was the death of Dragonlance. I can tell you that because it kind of just fizzled in the late 90s to the 2000s because it was so much convoluted crap that you love those heroes, you love those characters, and you want to see their lives go. So what I'm saying is like that's what happened to Dragonlance. So go ahead, James. Tell me about what you try to do.
Part of that is true. Part of that is true, and part of it is true, and it's more complicated even than with the comics, because there were eventually multiple threads for this all happening at once. So you have the games doing their thing, and the thing that's the games aren't just source books like a reference book. And this is something everybody was learning as we're designing all of this stuff, because when you create a scenario, a module for a role-playing game, you have to write a story that has room for players who are not, for voices, for co-creators who are not at the table. So, because players are going to play that scenario. So you write the plot and you send it out, and people are going to use that plot in ways you can't imagine. Their characters are not the ones you created. They're going to add their voices to that. So you've got that being created. You've got fiction being created where that isn't the case, where there are no co-creator voices in there other than the other people in the shared world who you are either being faithful to or not by maintaining the continuity. And then you've got licensed products like the comics and things like that that are also doing their thing that may or may not align with what's being done with this other stuff. So all of this was being done live. We were, I did a big Forgotten Realms project, the Avatar project, which was supposed to explain the changes between first and second edition of the role-playing game in the Forgotten Realms that had comics and all this other stuff attached to it too. All of these are being written at the same time. It was a complete nightmare for any, doing the kind of continuity that you're talking about. So what you're saying is absolutely true. There was also a giant fight within the company for which is the dog and which is the tail.
Yeah.
So the fiction far was outselling the role-playing game stuff other than the core game. The Ravenloft box set sold a fraction of what my novel or Christie Golden's novel Vampire of the Mist, which was the first Ravenloft novel, sold. They were far outselling the game stuff. So which is who gets to determine then what the continuity is, right? Is it the fiction or is it the game stuff? And then there's that intercompany kind of squabbles. The other thing that happened, especially with the fiction after about 1992, 1993, and I would encourage everybody to take a look at that's interested in this kind of history, especially the creative history, is take a look at Ben Rigg's book, Slaying the Dragon, that came out from St. Martin's last year, which talks about this era of TSR. But there were all kinds of changes in the book department from when we were a co-creator driven bullpen atmosphere, where we went from respecting everybody who was working on this stuff to a direction that didn't go in that direction, didn't support that idea, and it became very much creator unfriendly, and that got reflected in the content. The books, the quality of the books and the continuity of the books completely fell apart after a certain point.
Yes.
As with most.
Go ahead,
things,
Steve.
Right?
Right.
So I was just wondering, I'm going to use an analogy here. I know all of us here know the analogy. Can you remember Terminator 2?
Sure.
When they go to the lab and they find the arm and they're like, oh my God, this is the basis for everything. So a quick question for you, James. Did you somehow have access to the first draft of Harry Potter in 1988 so that you could base everything off that?
Well,
I know there's like a million Dungeon fans that like, I'm going to smack that guy.
Well, no, I mean, see, this is the thing, though, right? This was the earlier comment about, why was this sudden upsurge of sword and sorcery fantasy happening in comics and then in role-playing games and then in movies? Because culturally, these different creators are parallel drawing on the same basic source material. So, is Soth a ripoff of Dr. Doom? Not really. More along the lines of the Black Knight and some of the Arthurian stuff. Knowing the creators, was Tracy aware of the comics? Yes. Were these other things bigger influences? Yes. But that's all still in the blender, right? It's all still influencing it. So that all, it's not a shock that you see similarities in the tropes and the other things like that come through.
One thing I do want to make a comparison with, and I think it's sort of quite interesting because, yes, comics and the gaming, there is some overlap that you can see. However, I think there's one distinct difference. A lot of comic fans, particularly me when I was younger, was a loner and I was introverted. My comics were mine. My world was mine.
Yep.
I didn't want to share my world with anyone. Whereas people who are into games, they can get together in a little group and they're like, we're part of like a little club.
It's really that's a really interesting distinction because, and this is, I came from comic fandom as well, right? I mean, I go to, hey, there you go. Yes.
That's right. That's right. He did the Black Knight.
Thanks,
so not
Brian.
that Black Knight. I'm talking the Arthurian.
No, I know.
But I went to Comic Cons in Boston, too, and there is a fundamental difference between comic book conventions. Excuse me. There was a fundamental difference between comic book conventions in the 70s, 80s, and 90s and role-playing game conventions, because role-playing game conventions, people do come and they sit down, and a lot of times they play games with people they don't know. It's a very different vibe. They feel invested in the world because I've created this character, and that's the joke, right? About people for comic book conventions, you expect if you're working the booth for the publisher, somebody's going to come up and they're going to show you here's my design for Superman. Or role-playing game conventions, it's let me tell you about my character, and here's this 57th level elf that, and I'm going to tell you the story. Well, that's because they've created that character and they're part of that story, and your books or whatever you've done is set in the Kryn or Forgotten Realms, and they're co-creators with you of that. On whatever level that is true, they are part of that. That's not the way comics work or used to work, because your relationship with the text is different. You are reading it, and it's a two-way relationship, but it's a two-way solo relationship. It's just what you were saying, Steve.
Yes.
Where you see that different now, that's where cosplay comes from. That's where a lot of the other ways in which people go to conventions now and show their participation in the creations that they're fans of. That's them doing the same sorts of things that people do when they go to role-playing games. But the relationship between the audience and the work is very different than between games.
Steve, it's funny you say that, because it's funny when the Marvel superhero role-playing game came out in '84, that blew my mind as a kid, because I actually thought I can now be the Hulk. I can be the Thing in the story.
That's the thing, right? So
it was huge.
When you play those characters in the Marvel role-playing game, you are controlling the narrative in those characters. The story that you tell with Captain America around your table with your friends, or even better, the story where you create a character who goes and gets to be an Avenger for this mission. You are participating in the narrative creation and in the world and the intellectual property, or whatever you want to call it, the setting, in ways that is fundamentally different than the way most people interact with media. You watch a movie, you don't participate in it. That's Rocky Horror, right? I mean, Rocky Horror is breaching that, that relationship, that you're not just a passive audience.
It's funny you say that.
It's a great question, Steve, because that's one of the things, I work in prose fiction, I work in comics, I work in role-playing games, I work in all of these media as a creator and as an editor. So they all have their own rules, right? And the rules extend to how the audience interacts with them.
Yeah, because it was funny, because we played the Kree-Skrull War. That was the scenario, and we had to kind of go through it and all the way to go. And I remember that, it was so cool to do that, because like I said, I got more into the Marvel stuff later. I love the D&D stuff, but when the Marvel stuff came, I got more obsessed, because you could, and especially when the advanced set came out, because you could be the Hulk. You couldn't be the Hulk in the first set; he was too powerful. So, but I just remember being so enthralled by it, because it was such a unique way of playing, and I got that attachment. I was never a big arcade guy. I was never a big video game guy, but the role-playing games, because I have such a, like Steve, we just have these crazy imaginations that stemmed from the comic books, that the D&D stuff and the Marvel stuff fulfilled that, because you immersed yourself, because James, when I was a kid, after I used to watch the live action Lou Ferrigno stuff, I had these cut tough skin jeans. I cut them, and I would run around my neighborhood in bare feet without a shirt, up and down the neighborhood, acting as the Hulk, and nobody wanted to play with me. Nobody.
Who's gonna play with this?
But when I got to the Marvel superhero stuff, we all got into it. People got into it because you could sit down and really, and they all kind of knew the Kree-Skrull War, and oh wow, well, and then it's just amazing.
That's one of the things that's interesting too about how you're doing these adaptations. So when you play the Kree-Skrull War, do you end up with the same story that you end up with in the comics? No, you actually don't.
No.
So and that was one of the things that initially with Dragonlance and some of the initial stuff that had feed in both worlds that were fiction and then had the scenario adaptations. You were supposed to play those characters from the novel, and you were supposed to then tell kind of the same story. But the problem is that's on rails, right? That's an amusement park ride on rails. That's not
Right.
letting you create a story. You know where this has to go, which is also one of the problems with video games that changes over time as you do the open world sandbox kind of games where you don't have to go do this, then this, then this, then this. And so that got learned over the course of the 80s and early 90s that you had to leave the player's room. You had to leave because they weren't going to use this the way you think they were going to. And that was actually my first interaction with Lord Soth. You had mentioned that I had read the novels after I had played the first scenario, the first module. And we played it with the group that I was playing, and this was before I worked at TSR. We used our own characters. We didn't use the Dragonlance characters.
Right.
So we had our own characters and we played them in those roles. And that was the first time, I ran into Lord Soth, was the game master running Lord Soth in the scenario that I played in.
Oh, that's so.
And then I went and read the books because this is kind of a cool. I like the setting. This is pretty neat. So,
See, it's just really quick. It's funny because I used to play when we used to play the Marvel game. I played with I actually played with a lot of people who lifted weights. They were wrestlers. They were athletes, and it was hard to get a story going because every time we met somebody, let's fight. You fight them. But we need to fight them. They were just very aggressive. So the stories were tough to go. But go ahead, Niall. Go ahead.
Well, I want to know. I know everything about the comic book making process. I know everything about the animation making process. I want to know what the process is that you guys were using, coming up with these books for the players to use as their guides and the modules.
It's very similar to because having done comics and all of that too. I mean, that was one of the things that I did at TSR was I was part of the licensing review team for the DC. That's how I got involved in the comics there. I was part of the licensing review for that, and then I eventually got to write one of the stories, and we were going to do there was going to be a Ravenloft comic that TSR messed up. The relationship with DC, that's a train wreck in itself. But the
I know that story.
Yeah, the process for that for creating the role-playing game stuff is very similar to any other kind of creative output, but there are aspects to it where role-playing game texts have two components to them. One is the aesthetic narrative text. Are these instructions clear? Do these concise, does this description of this character convey what you need it to convey? And that's the same as any other kind of prose. Then you have the mechanics for how the rule system works. And then that becomes a whole different problem because the only way to get that right is to play test it. Mm-hmm. The same thing with scenarios and that. I've written and have been running some things connected to my own fiction and comics, things that I own, for the last 6 or 7 years. And it was a great reminder. I've been running these 3 scenarios, especially the first one, at a lot of different conventions for people. And I just ran it this last weekend at a convention for some friends who are game designers. And of course, they figured out to do something that no one else has done in the 30 other times that I've ever run this. So when I write this scenario up for other people to run, because I have to be able to create that game scenario so that somebody else can pick it up and run the game and it can make sense for their players. So I've got to leave room for the players, and I've got to take into account that somebody needs to read these instructions and know how to run this game, and it's giving them all the information they need. So based on how that, Lester Smith, bless you, buddy, how you broke the game again when we ran it a couple of days ago after the 25th time I've run it, I'm going to have to take that into account with how I write up that game to either accommodate that play or to channel people away from it. You don't want to do this because
Now,
so that all gets involved in the process as you're putting it together.
Oh, fantastic. Now, has there been any really far out concepts on how people could play this game? Like, back in the day, the video game companies had the 900 numbers you could call for this or that. And was there anything that someone's like, I've got a brilliant idea how we could play this? And,
there's been all kinds of, I mean, the history of the game, I mean, there were, and you see this as the media gets developed. There was a thing called Terror Tracks, which was sort of a choose your own adventure thing with like skipping around on a CD.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. There were VHS, like with video games and things like that. There were, VHS components that people wanted to try. But really, the thing is, and this is one of the things that's great about role-playing games, and it's also the challenge for the industry. Really, all you need is the core rule book, the dice, and your friends. That's it.
Apple Vision. Think of the worlds you could have with Apple Vision. You'll just see 6 people walking around like Manhattan.
Right.
But in their world, they're in a quest.
Yeah, I mean, and so there's all sorts of VR stuff that's being tested out now, as well as virtual tabletops where people can play. I ran a game during the pandemic for my friends from high school who I used to play with. We hadn't played in 25 years, but because of Zoom and, virtual tabletops, we could get together and play, a game. It was amazing.
That's actually
cool. That's cool.
That leads into the next question that I was going to ask, because as someone who is a complete novice,
right,
I'm hearing this stuff, and here we are in the age where, we finally have, computers and routers and stuff that could move things at quite a good speed. So, am I right in my understanding that as the computer access and technology increased and people were able to play this game without having like delays, that then Dungeons and Dragons had another influx of life and that this whole new audience came along?
Yes,
when did that begin? When did this second life come along?
So part of the pandemic actually was a big boost. There were a couple of things in recent years, because D&D right now is bigger than it's ever been. There have been a couple of things that had a huge impact on that. One was Zoom and things like that, because it's easier to get a group of people together to play.
Yes.
The actual play movement has been giant in this, and actual play is Critical Role and different groups that you can find a ton of this stuff on like YouTube and all over the internet. There are people who play D&D or Call of Cthulhu or Traveler or any of these other games. They get around a table and they film it, and you get to watch people play.
Oh.
And because of that, it did two things. It let people know, wow, the barrier to entry for me to actually be able to play this game, super low. This is much simpler than I thought it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It has these really intimidating giant rule books, but actually the game is a group of people sitting around and telling stories, right? And having fun. So the way you used to learn about role-playing games was you knew somebody who played, and you were, inducted into the cult that somebody taught you how to play, and then you, if you were good, went and taught other people how to play. That's a limiting kind of thing. So with the actual play, it meant I could watch a video for an hour on YouTube and go, bing, light goes on. Wow, this is really accessible. I would like to do this, right? This is fun. And then the other media thing that changed, D&D has become such an integral part. The things that D&D created as concepts have become such an integral part of culture that people aren't intimidated by it anymore. Levels, hit points, experience points, all of these things that if you use your insurance app and you go up levels by driving safe, you've gone up a level like you have in a role-playing game. You played Pokemon Go, you know what experience points mean. all of that then takes away the mystique and the barrier of entry for how to play the games. So it's much simpler. I think role-playing games, and this is true with comics as well, it's part of the reason comics aren't benefiting from the expansion of comic book movies. Comic books as an art form require interaction with the content in ways that are more complicated than, say, a straight novel. Role-playing games actually require you to put in effort and put in time and investment in the game that is different from even computer games, so that there's still a barrier to entry. It's still not a mass market kind of thing.
Yeah, Steve, I wanna tell you guys, you too, James. This is going to be interesting. I'll tell you how I first got into D&D. I didn't even know you could play it. Like, we were just so fascinated with comic books. When these kids, we had this free reading, and then 20 minutes of free reading, and in grammar school, and you would have a book. And I remember a kid had the Legends and Lore. The deity and demigods one, the one with the Cthulhu, with Elric and the Cthulhu stuff in it. But Steve, we looked through these books, and it had the Greek pantheon and it had the Norse pantheon. That's all I cared about. You could be Thor or you could be Hercules, and you could have the Jack Kirby slugfest. So what we used to do at recess, we could look at the stats. And Thor Mjolnir killed everybody. Thor was the most powerful thing in AD&D. I mean, it was ridiculous. But what was so funny is we would have these gladiator fights, and we would just use the dice, and because the kid taught us, you use the dice and you use the stats, and we would have these fights. And oh my God, he could, he goes berserk if after half his hit points are gone and all that. Thor wipe the floor with everybody. But but that's what got me into it, because you could play these things, but you're not playing with toys, you're playing with your mind. And then the kid told me, that he was telling us, oh, you hit him, he goes flying to the wall, and it would be we'd be going nuts on the playground. But I just got to say this, Mjolnir was the most powerful thing, but when Hercules went to half his hit points, Steve, he got plus 25 damage, bonus. So that essentially made him the most strongest physical thing in all of AD&D. And it was like the Hulk. Like I said, I thought about it I remember having the Jack Kirby, what is it? The Mighty Thor 125, the Hercules versus Thor in New York fighting over that girl. But we could think about it, and actually do it, and that was my introduction into D&D, AD&D. That was it.
That's a great example of what I was saying earlier, where you wanted to tell this story, right? You wanted to tell the story of that battle, and the dice and the rule system just said, this is what happens when you get who does this damage. And so that's all it is. That's the game. It's we want to tell this story, and the rules give you a framework for telling it.
But then there's something that's confusing me here.
Yeah.
Because if I was there with you, John, and we were opening up that book, I would be Thor.
No, you could be. You could be Thor. I want to be Hercules.
Okay, but if you wanted to be Thor too, how do you divvy up who gets who?
Oh, that's you got to go fight on the playground. You're going to win that one.
For the most part, what happens is you're creating your own characters. So you create your own Thor. Yeah. You do your own thing.
Oh, okay. Because I know that if I would have been Thor every time, in every game, and everyone would be like,
you could do Steve Thor. Right, your Thor is not John's Thor. Your
His name is Thor.
I mean, that's it. Really, I mean, that's one of the things that's so great about role-playing games. If you want to do that story and you want to have two Thors, and these Thors are not the same Thor, because Steve, your Thor is not John's Thor.
Yeah, because mine would be like the ultimate Thor, and his would be like some weak East Coast Thor.
Hey now.
Hey, we we would play so passionately that I remember this kid, Dana, his name was Dana Bork. He was one of the, I think he was Horus. And Thor just crushed him. He got so mad. He took the dice, the little 20-sided dice, and he threw it across. We couldn't find it. He threw it across the playground into like the grass area. But that's how passionate we got. We got so crazy. Such a fun time.
We got a great comment here from Brian. Thanks to James for Prince of Lies. Cyric is fascinating and still inspirational in my games.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Cyric is one of the gods in the Forgotten Realms that I had a hand in creating. That was the Avatar thing that I was talking about earlier. I was the editor and the project manager for the initial trilogy, and then wrote Prince of Lies, which was focused on those characters in the Forgotten Realms.
Nice. And you
By the
were
way,
Niall, can you show
a huge fan? I had no idea. And I laughed at him when he told me.
Right.
John Dolmayan. I first met him.
Oh, is he?
Oh, I know his personality. So he's a Lord of the Rings nut, right? He's a Lord of the Rings nut. And then he said that he had been dungeon master for 10 years. He was like totally invincible. He was like the man. And the way he's talking. And I was like, wait a minute. I said, so while I was running around the forests of Germany to protect you from the Soviet Union, you're playing with dice in your room. And, he was like, well, it's not quite like that, So I ripped him terribly. And he go, because he was so proud. He's like, yeah, I put the thing on and I was the dungeon master. It's like, yeah, get away from me. But yeah, huge. I knowing his personality.
James, do you know who No, I said, do you know who, James, do you know who Steve's talking about, John Dolmayan?
No, I don't.
Tell him.
John
tell him,
Dolmayan is
Steve.
the drummer from System of a Down. He's also the
yes. And this is, I was just at a convention where Tom Morello was playing games, and it's amazing. And this is the thing, right? This has this giant influence now on culture that people grew up with that. And you mentioned, Lord of the Rings too, right? One of the people who worked on the third edition of D&D, John Ratliff, one of the editors, was the guy who just did the big History of the Hobbit book a couple of years ago. I know John was in grad school when I was an undergrad at Marquette, where the Tolkien manuscripts are largely housed in Milwaukee. And so we came very close to TSR to doing a Lord of the Rings game, but the company wanted to do original fiction, and the estate said no.
Yes, I can understand why they would.
Which was really for the best. I was in the house at the time.
Yes.
That was for the best.
But it's really funny because we have John. He's the drummer. Back in the day, he was like a rock star type guy.
Right.
But then when you scratch beneath the surface, you'd be like, oh man, I gotta tell you, we had this 3-day game where we didn't go, and oh man, and then someone challenged me, and I had to crush him with this. And I was like,
that's awesome. Yeah,
God's sakes, man, anyone around him's like they want to hear stories of sniffing coke and doing stuff like this. Like, oh, don't do any of that.
We had our dice on the doorpost. So yeah, I mean that's the other part of it, right? I mean this is where you see the Marvel movies and all of the rest of it, right? That it's become such a big part of the overall culture that people who had been doing this and kind of kept it to themselves feel like, well, now I can actually admit that I read all these comics and stuff.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
We're out of the closet, people. We're out of the closet.
Yeah. And I think there was also another resurgence of people asking questions. I think when the Stranger Things came out.
Absolutely.
Series 1.
Right, yeah.
Oh,
because
that media representation.
Yes. Now, obviously, they weren't using
I'm curious about this. So that
they weren't using the exact terminology, but anyone who was sort of there was like, I know what they're doing. That's Dungeons and Dragons they're playing.
Exactly. And so that it's like the actual play. That was the other part of that access, the visibility where people can look at it and go, oh, okay, that's not intimidating at all.
Yes.
This actually looks fun. I would like to try that.
Yes.
So yeah, totally.
Okay, James, we got two pictures. Niall, show him the first one, when the picture of him. I want to know where you got this shirt, and I wanted, if you look closely, that's Thor flying above, but I'd never seen that shirt before. Where did you? I know all the 70s shirts, and I never saw them.
That shirt is, if you look at the Marvel bicentennial calendar, that's the Avengers crossing, the George Washington crossing the Delaware. That's the Avengers George Washington crossing the Delaware picture for on that. So yeah, talking about totally not being cool, right? So this is 1981. In 80 or 81. And so yeah, playing with
look closely, Steve. Look at Thor flying up there. I saw, and then you see the Dungeon Master's guide. That is a great picture of just a perfect moment in time. Wearing the suit.
It is. So yeah, we were playing D&D at a friend's house in 1981, and they one of my friends snapped that picture, and
wow.
Cannot be any less cool in 1981.
I think the biggest question here is, how did John get into your house to get this photo in the first place?
No, that was I posted that on Facebook.
I can sniff out those Marvel. When I saw that Thor above there, that's right.
Yeah, it's the bicentennial calendar.
Yes, I have a funny feeling that
John's going to find it. I have it.
Yeah. In the next 2 or 3 weeks, he's going to find that T-shirt somewhere. I know it.
So now you know what it is.
Here
right?
it is.
So yes, that I like that shirt.
Okay, and James, I want you to. You need to tell me the story of writing the Knight of the Black Rose and how this came, because I know it was a big controversy with Margaret Weiss, Tracy Hickman. Tell us the story. The reason why let me just go a little background here. The reason why I show these 3 books is that these are 3 stories. They're in chronological order of the Lord Soth, who was in the Dragonlance, but he came to Ravenloft, and then there's a short story in the Tales of Ravenloft, which you adapted into a comic book, and then the Spectre of the Black Rose. Tell the unedited history of this, because there was a lot of controversy, and it was so good, but people are pissed to this day.
They are. And actually, it was a book I didn't want to. Knight of the Black Rose was a book I did not want to see happen. One of the things that I did when I got in-house at TSR was I was very much a kind of creator rights advocate sort of person to coming in. I was things like the Steve Gerber, Howard the Duck stuff had informed my attitude on how companies should treat creators, right?
Oh.
So the plan was to do this. They were going to do, Ravenloft had originally been Tracy Hickman, who created the Dragonlance world with Margaret Weiss, had done this standalone module Ravenloft, which is about characters getting pulled into this misty nether world where you encounter this vampire lord Strahd, and you fight him and you mostly die, or you escape at the end of it. It was sort of this demi-plane where Ravenloft, the castle Ravenloft, existed. And the management at TSR decided they were going to do a whole box set and expand out and do all of these other domains. So there would be a domain like Frankenstein's monster, and there would be a werewolf domain, and there would be all of these other kind of pastiche sort of things that were all pulled together for this thing. And the idea was that they would pull a character from the Forgotten Realms and a character from Dragonlance, because those 2 book lines were incredibly successful. And just in terms of, and this is something that's gotten lost kind of over time, and it's one of those crazy things about TSR in this era. Circa 1989, 1990, 1991, the core when I was there at the company, TSR was the most successful science fiction fantasy fiction publisher in the country.
Yeah.
We had every book that we released in those lines were bestsellers. Like automatically, you would sell 100 to 150,000 copies of these novels, and you would automatically show up on the bestseller list at B. Dalton's and Walden Books and that. I have bestseller lists where, you know, for that week I outsold Stephen King. Woo!
Yeah.
Wow.
For that week.
Nice.
That's
you know,
huge.
Yeah.
which,
Think
yeah,
about that,
you
Steve.
know, I was, you know, and eventually by 92, because of the distribution stuff, the company was regularly hitting like New York Times bestsellers too.
Oh, wow.
That Avatar book, the Avatar series that I did, Waterdeep, the third book of that was the first Forgotten Realms New York Times bestseller. Incredible how successful we were out of this podunky 4-person staff, 5-person staff book department out of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. So we're going to do the Ravenloft box set, and we're going to do fiction. And the first book was going to be Vampire of the Mist with Strahd, and a character was going to get pulled out of the Forgotten Realms. There wasn't anybody who stood out enough. So Christy Golden got to create Chandra Sunstar, the main character for that book. And the book did phenomenally well. It was the first book Christy wrote. She's gone on to do all kinds of things in fiction and computer games. Super talented author. That was her first thing. I was the editor for the Ravenloft line for fiction. I had been hired because I had a foot in both fiction and gaming. I could do the projects that actually did the crossover stuff, a lot of the planned crossover. So I was given Ravenloft because there was going to be a lot of original, a lot of active crossover between the fiction and the gaming stuff. Second book was going to be Knight of the Black Rose, pulling Lord Soth, who was the iconic villain of the original Dragonlance novels, into the Mist and give him his own domain, Sithicus, which was going to be built around Lord Soth. And the domains reflect the personality of the Dark Lord, the person who's sort of in charge of the domain. I thought it was a bad idea because Margaret and Tracy were unhappy about Soth being used that way. They were no longer working with the company because the company had before I came in, had treated them badly. They had gone off and were, because of the success of the first 6 Dragonlance novels, had lots of novel contracts in New York. They were very busy. But they were annoyed about this. I tried to get it stopped, couldn't get it stopped. We hired an author. We did auditions at that point, which was how actually I found Christy Golden. I'm the one who discovered her through those audition processes. We had assigned Knight of the Black Rose to another author who had done a pretty solid proposal for it. We got to the first stage where the first chapters were supposed to come in, and it turned out that there was a real problem. I can't really get into what the problem was, but what it turned out to be was that author left the project. The book was still on the schedule, however, and had already been, the cover was already painted. The book had been announced for this point in the schedule. It was going to happen. So we frantically tried to get another. I tried again. No, see, this is a sign. We don't need this book. Let's do something else. Nope, it's going to go on the schedule. We held a bunch of auditions and tried to find a replacement author. And all of the authors who proposed things completely messed up the character. And the one thing that I was adamant about was that the character had to respect what Margaret and Tracy had done with him in the original book.
That's awesome. That's great what you did there, man. That's awesome.
So there were people that wanted to change, do all of the sorts of things. This will do this to Soth, and whatever. The proposals, none of them worked out. So my boss called me into her office and said, "There is only one person who can write this book, and it's you. But I don't want this book to happen. I don't."
Yeah.
But the only way this book is going to happen, and it is not going to mess up this character for Margaret and Tracy, is for you to write it. I had even called Margaret. It was the first time Margaret and I ever talked. I called Margaret and said, please, if you guys want to write it, if you and Tracy want to write the book, I would, you can write it. It can be yours. You can do it. And I totally understand why they said no. They didn't want to see the book happen either, and they weren't going to participate. So what ended up happening is I wrote the book. And the way I wrote it, the arc for this thing, and so there, as you showed with the pictures, there are 3 installments in this. Night of the Black Rose is a novel. There's a short story in Tales of Ravenloft. And then Spectre of the Black Rose was done almost a decade later, and it explains how Soth gets out of Ravenloft. And you're not supposed to be able to escape Ravenloft. There's dark powers that keep those Dark Lords in place because they're either being tortured or rewarded with infinite power, or, you're not supposed to know what's going on. I built it into the first book that the mechanism for Soth escaping Ravenloft could be triggered at any time when Margaret and Tracy came back to write for TSR.
That was awesome. That's such a great thing.
The character back. I built it in so that when they came, and that's what happened when the second book happened. The second book happened because after Wizards of the Coast bought TSR, there was a change in how the department was run. Margaret and Tracy came back. They said, we want Soth. They said, Wizards of the Coast said, do you want to write the book? And I said, I've already set it up. So yeah, I mean, I can finish this and give them back to Margaret and Tracy. That was my plan all along. And so he basically goes back to them in the shape that he was when he left. He remembers his story. He confirms who he is. And he is the character that left Kryn. And it could go in the way time travel works between the dimensions in this, the demiplane for Ravenloft. He could have been gone 5 minutes from Kryn.
You're right.
Books take place over years, but he could have been gone 5 minutes. They get him back exactly when they want it. And that was my mission with how those came about. The ironic part is, of course, that Night of the Black Rose has sold the best out of any of the novels that I've written. It's been translated like a dozen times. It's I got to create all the other supporting characters for it. I got to create, there's a weir badger in it, a dwarven weir badger. But all of those are characters that I created. And I got to create the domain of Sithicus and do the characters in the second book too. So,
James, what I loved is how you respected the character. Steve, this story right here reminds me of Jim Starlin with Thanos. Like when they took Thanos and they just started doing all this crap with him. And then remember when Starlin came back and he had Thanos make all these prototypes and all that stuff, and he killed them all, and he was going through all the different types and he was killing them all because he couldn't take Khazar beating the shit out of Thanos and all that stuff, like all that crazy stuff. But what James was actually doing was trying to stop this character from coming, and it was to the creators didn't like that. He was trying to, so he knew he couldn't stop that, but he respected it so much and respected them. I mean,
there was a game scenario that was published around the time too that I actually was originally supposed to write. That when the Black Roses bloom.
The module.
So, but the plot with the memory mirrors, that was my plot, and that was also the way with like the Starlin thing with the, that was to show there could be these variant things.
Yes.
But
so
that was
good.
So I didn't end up writing it, but they handed that to Lisa when Lisa wrote it, and she did a fantastic job with it and kept true to all of it.
James, that's why I want people to hear you say this, because when I sometimes talk to people about that, they were like, because Tracy Hickman and Margaret, they got a lot of rabid fan base. Oh, that never happened. They said it never happened. Ravenloft never happened. But what I like is that they can see the respect that you had for this character, and you wanted it to be pristine when it went back untouched. And you understood that. And that's something that a lot of the people don't understand. And like,
the thing is that's, I've written probably more words about Soth than anybody.
yeah, I know.
Soth is Margaret and Tracy's character. Margaret and Tracy created Soth. He's theirs. And, I was a shepherd, caretaker, and I did it with respect from them.
Oh,
And I'm still friends with Margaret and Tracy. I mean, this is, and to their fans who want to say that Ravenloft never happened, okay, it didn't. If you don't want it to be in your continuity, it doesn't have to be.
right.
If it did, it did. And it did, and it didn't change the character. I mean, and that's one of the things I tried initially, and this is when I got the assignment for this. It was a bear. I mean, I how am I going to do this and not screw this up? Because the
Right.
last thing I want to do is take this on and not deliver. So one of the first things that happens in the book is a new version of the Siege of Palanthas, which happens in the original Six Dragonlance novels, from the perspective of the heroes.
Right.
But this is from the perspective of Soth. So Soth looks and sees Tanis and sees the characters do these things. And he's like, yeah, he ran away from me because of this. Because, Soth is, of course he's afraid of me. Anybody who's read the original novels knows Tanis's point of view and
Right.
the hero's point of view from that story. But it doesn't change any of the facts. It just says this is another perspective on it.
I love that.
And again, that's completely out of respect for Margaret Tracy, because what they did was phenomenal with those
Yeah. It was so big. It was good. Steve, you think any writers do that now in comic books? You think any of that happens? Do they get that type of respect?
No, because even if you did try, you would have a 19-year-old editor that had just been fired from.
There are people. Well, look, there are people, and this is the thing. There are people in comics who do respect the past and do respect the material that's gone before. The problem is that and it's not even the editors. This isn't the fault of the editors. This is the fault of the way the corporations handle this stuff.
No, of course.
Because the pressure on, because this is the thing. The editors, the other writers, the other people who are brought in all want to do good work. Nobody goes into any of these things, even if you disagree with what the outcome is. None of the creators who go into these things are trying to do bad work or trying to disrespect who came before them. The way the publishing operation is set up and the way the corporations that own these properties run these, they're the ones who could guarantee it happens, and they don't do it. That's where the fault lies.
Yeah. Wow. Go ahead now.
No, that's great. I mean, D&D and stuff like that, I haven't dabbled in much of it, but it's cool. I love processes and being able to hear you talk about, the making of it, just kind of, how all this stuff's done. One thing I wanted to ask you, though, is because, when researching you, I did see that you, the world of Dungeons and Dragons, you worked on multiple volumes of that.
Yep.
Was that something of just kind of organizing everything that was put in through all the years of it and compiling it?
So
Almost like an encyclopedia?
Devil's Due. I had gotten that was kind of interesting. Devil's Due, the comic book company out of Chicago, had the license to do adaptations of the Drizzt and Dragonlance comics, and they decided they wanted to do an anthology series, and it was going to be Worlds of Dungeons and Dragons, which is, that was. Kind of funny. I had actually proposed that title for a book to DC Comics back at one point, and the issue that did come out was TSR Worlds rather than Worlds of Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
That's the one that I actually originally wrote Spelljammer Forgotten Realms crossover for. Got to work with Rags Morales, who's amazing. So Devil's Due was putting these together, and it was going to be adaptations, 2 stories per issue of short stories from anthologies that TSR and Wizards of the Coast had published. And they discovered, as they started looking at these, that either I had written or edited the majority of the initial fiction that they wanted to do. So they got me involved with Mike O'Sullivan, who was the other editor on those books. So I became the editor on those. And we did 7 issues before Devil's Due lost the license. And they were adaptations of existing realms in Ravenloft and Eberron and different stories. Where possible on that, I got the original authors of the fiction to write the adaptations of their own stories.
Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
wow, that is awesome.
So,
Yeah.
and when they couldn't do it, they were still involved in the approval process and still reviewed the stuff to make sure that it stayed true to their story. That was a way in which actually, the other tricky part of this on my part, the original fiction contracts did not give those writers any money when the stories were adapted into comics. If I hired them to do the adaptation, they got paid them.
Mm-hmm.
So so most of the stories were actually done by either the original authors or somebody the original author said, this is the person, I want to do it. And they were very successful. I'm very happy with how those came out. That's how I ended up doing the adaptation of Rigor of the Game, the story, the soft story that I did for
I love it. I got it.
and that was Tim Seeley did the art for that. Tim's a great guy. I'm a big fan of Tim's stuff. But through Devil's Due, I ended up editing, with Tim, about 75 issues of Hack Slash through Devil's Due and Image. I wrote some stuff for Hack Slash as well. So yeah, it was great. But yeah, so that's where the Worlds of D&D stuff came from. The 2 volumes are trade paperback collections of the first 6 or 7 issues.
Nice.
Now, in winding down, James, I want you to say one more story because when DC got the TSR, they got the TSR line. They did Dragonlance, they did the Forgotten Realms, and I don't know if you remember this, Steve, but in the 80s, like 88, they got the license. DC got the license, and Roy actually did the first volume of Dragonlance. They got Roy on it, and he did the first book. And I asked Roy, how come you never did the other 2? Because it was supposed to be all 3 books, but he did the first graphic novels. He adapted those in that first Dragonlance book. But didn't TSR do something a little shady? And they lost Tell Steve this. This is a great story.
TSR was constantly screwing up the stuff with DC. And this was amazing for me, being a comics fan, of getting to work, because like I said, initially my involvement with the DC TSR comics was as licensing approval in the book department, because they were looking for anybody in-house who could look at scripts and look at art and knew comic books enough to be able to say, yeah, this does what we want it to do. And so I did the licensing approvals for the Forgotten Realms and the AD&D comic, and I did some review for the Spelljammer comic. Before that, they had done those adaptations of the Dragonlance things, and this was earlier. And Roy did the first 3 or 4, and then TSR didn't like what DC was doing with it and pulled the 4th or 5th adaptations and did those as the oversized trade paperback things that were common in the 80s. And they self-published those. Those were just published by TSR. So those were rare. Through Mike Gold, they got things settled back down, and they decided that they were just going to license the comics to DC. And so they did, and that's where those books came from. IDW did trade paperbacks of a lot of these recently, the collections for them. So they were doing incredibly well. Especially, they had Dan Mishkin and Docemo were doing the AD&D comic, and we were getting to work with Kim Yale and Elliot Magan on the editorial stuff. It just, legends, right? And they were doing well enough that DC wanted to expand the line. And so in, like around 89, 90, we were talking about adding a Ravenloft comic book monthly and a Greyhawk comic book. And I think the third one was Dark Sun. I'm not sure if it was early enough for that. So maybe this was 91. And DC was really gung ho on that. I actually have the plot, the first dozen issues of the Ravenloft comic plotted out because I was going to write that. What DC didn't want was Buck Rogers, and TSR at the time was owned by the heir to the Buck Rogers estate, Buck Rogers fortune. And she wanted them to do Buck Rogers, and they did not want to do Buck Rogers. So, and this was still in the aftermath of the Gil Gerard tweaky era of Buck Rogers, right? I mean, Buck was not terribly popular. And, DC could have done a really fun comic. All could have been good, but, they were just not interested. So TSR started a TSR West division, and they brought in some comic people who knew what they were doing. And they published these things called comic modules. Now, DC had an exclusive license for comic books. Putting a 2-page game in the back of a comic book and saying this is a comic module, not a comic book as defined in our obviously clear license, was not going to thrill DC Comics. And so TSR West released Buck Rogers stuff, and they did a horror comic called R.I.P. and Intruder. And, some of these involved people who were serious comic book people. But they crashed the DC license. So DC just, after those came out, DC pulled the license, and TSR's plan to, we're going to bury DC and show them we can publish more comics, better comics than them, blew up within a year, and they sunk a couple of $1 million into the TSR West operation.
Yeah.
And Buck Rogers foiled me getting to write that damn Ravenloft comic. It was unbelievable. And they would do stuff like that pretty regularly. Ben Riggs covers this a little bit in Slaying the Dragon. There's some stuff online about it too.
I'm talking to Ben now. I want to get him on because I want to hear that whole backstory. That lady who was heir, she had her own vision, and that vision just was a brick wall. And and
it was Flint Dilley too, who was her brother, who had done a bunch of stuff in Hollywood too. Getting approvals and processes stuff done through the Buck Rogers license was nightmarish. I mean, the first thing I ever wrote for TSR, and I actually haven't talked about this much, and this may be the first time I've talked about it in public, is a ghost-written Buck Rogers story for the anthology Arrival, fiction anthology, because it was a short story anthology of different Buck Rogers stories that were supposed to involve these big name science fiction authors, and they got so pissed off dealing with the approval process for the Buck Rogers estate that right before it went to print, a couple of them quit. And so I had to write a draft of this short story for the Black Barney short story, Princess Ardala Black Barney short story for this anthology over a weekend. And then the editor belt sanded it and put it in the wood chipper, and that's what came out under a pseudonym, Ulrike O'Reilly, which I did not come up with. That's totally not a fake name there. And that's me. And I've actually never read the published story, so I don't know how much of mine actually made it in. But Pat McGilligan, who was the editor, rewrote my stuff. And then there was another story in that book that was ghosted by somebody over a weekend too. And so that was really standard for dealing with the Buck stuff. And there were some great products that the company released, because they kept releasing Buck Rogers role-playing games and board games and other
I know.
stuff. And some of them were really good, but nobody wanted them. I mean, there was no demand for them. But the company was going to keep publishing them whether you wanted them or not, because the estate was getting money. So,
and didn't, when TSR finally got bought, she kept the Buck Rogers though. She got to keep. She got
to keep Buck when TSR was bankrupt and almost sold off to a bunch of other places, and Wizards of the Coast bought them. She demanded that she keep Buck, which Peter Atkinson the guy who was running Wizards of the Coast at the time reluctantly said, "Okay, I guess you can keep Buck if you want."
Poor Buck Rogers.
Yeah. So yeah.
All right, guys. Any last words for Steve? Any last words for Mr. Lowder?
Well, it's definitely been a pleasure. It's been, again, I always love these episodes because they're so educational. Usually I come in and I'm lathering information on and, lording over with my head the size of, the leader.
Right.
But on this occasion, I can just sit here and then I can just soak in this information. So when anyone asks me a question now, I can say, yes, I'm also an expert just like you. So
Hey, you had great questions. No, you totally get it. I mean, the questions you had about like the difference between gaming and comics and that, right on.
Now,
I mean, I feel it's just only fitting. We've had such a great conversation, and there's so many D&D adaptations. There's movies, films, but man, sometimes you just gotta, enjoy the best thing that ever came from D&D. The most revolutionary animated series of 1985.
made by Marvel too. Marvel Studios.
Yeah. There was I mean, there was talk for Marvel getting the comic license at one point that never came to pass. TSR had the Marvel role-playing game license at the time.
Mm-hmm.
There were some old Marvel guys, attached to this series writing it too.
Oh yeah.
It only lasted one season.
It did.
It never finished too.
Well, the cool part is so the two things with this, and again, this is how mainstream this has become. Those characters make a cameo in the D&D movie.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And there is a car company in South America that
Yep.
made a commercial that shows them getting out, that closes the series. It's brilliant. It's a great commercial.
Yeah. So Steve, you should know, like Gary Gygax was he was like Stan Lee, because after TSR did it, he went to Hollywood to try like where Stan Lee got out, and when he started like the Marvel Studios, Gygax kind of in his own way was almost like like doing kind of following in that footsteps with TSR and stuff. So it was very interesting and all that stuff. But yeah, that was a huge cartoon. We all watched it, and the box set, they actually got the old voice people, and they actually filmed that last episode. Yeah. And who did the unicorn one? Who co-created Harley Quinn? He's Bruce Timm, and who's the other guy?
Bruce Timm and Paul Dini.
Paul Dini?
Paul Dini?
Yeah. Well, he wrote a few episodes of the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. He wrote like a few episodes. Paul Dini.
Didn't Larry Houston work on the animation too? Larry Houston worked on that too.
I don't know.
Paul Taylor didn't like the cartoon though. He said, "Oh no," when I brought it up. Thanks, Paul.
But James, thank you so much for coming. I love to get this. Once again, wrestling, comic books, Dungeons and Dragons were like a huge part of my life, and like obviously I'm OCD and I get so obsessed with this stuff that like I love to hear the back stories about that. And plus, once again, like when I got into Lord Soth, that book, like I said, that you get a real feeling of who Lord Soth is, because he's always kind of just a background character that everybody loved.
Yeah,
but you kind of a
lot of the scenes in the original stuff. So it was trying to figure out how to write that character over a long period of time. And this is the challenge for anybody, with the comic stuff we were talking about. Anybody who would come in now and write Shazam, right? So you look at what Mark Waid is doing with Shazam, with the new DC book. That shows obviously an affection for the Megan stuff and all of the other stuff that came before it. That's a real challenge. It's a real challenge.
Absolutely. And I love the fact that you had such respect for the character. Like, like I said, it's good that people can recognize those stories. And I love that. Like there's good people behind the scenes trying to do the right thing, but like corporate is just not letting them. And Buck Rogers is okay. Gil Gerard, you're all right. It was always a little tight.
There were possibilities. There was a Mike Pondsmith and other people did a role-playing game. One of the role-playing sets they did for Buck Rogers, super fun. It was a pulp science fiction space opera adventure. The board game, they did a giant board game in like 87, 88, tons of moving pieces. I demoed that at the first Gen Con I worked at for the company.
Hey, when it comes to the Buck Rogers TV series, I was a fanatic like you wouldn't believe.
I was a fan of it too.
Because Buck Rogers and Battlestar Galactica came out at the same time, and it destroyed Doctor Who. Because, because as soon as I saw those two, I was like, oh my God, look at that. And of course, I'm a lover of spandex. And if you're going to be a lover of spandex, and you're going to love Buck Rogers, okay?
Right.
You don't want to get James. We don't want to talk about Steve's other life, but we'll talk one thing. I'll give you one thing with Buck Rogers. Erin Gray, as she was even as a little kid. My God.
No, I like the Queen of Dala. Erin Gray, too vanilla. Too vanilla. Go away.
All right, Steve, get us out of here. Mighty Mystic Millionaire.
Boom.
Spandex forever.
Hey everyone! Thank you for joining us on Pop XP. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and also click the bell for notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome new content. Also, don't forget to head on over to Twitter and follow us at the Pop XP, and over on Instagram at the Pop XP. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you soon.